In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Luther in Heidelberg. And we're not just looking at the Heidelberg Disputation, but rather we're seeing that the Heidelberg Disputation is something of a pivot for Luther in his development of his theology and his public expression of his faith after the 95 Theses and before he's put on trial at the Diet of Worms. And we can begin by discussing what happens after the 95 Theses that gives rise to the debate that carried Luther further and further into controversy. And we ended our last lecture with Luther posting the 95 Theses on October 31st, and some scholars have doubted whether or not there was actually a posting or a nailing of the Theses. In Luther's life, he rarely talks about this. Instead, he typically talks about what happens after the 95 Theses. But there are two things that propel Luther onto the public stage. The first is that in January of 1518, the Theses are taken, they're translated into German from Latin, thus making them accessible to any layman who could read, or, more likely, those who could read aloud would read it to those who couldn't. And the German translation of the 95 Theses were printed off and passed and sent around throughout a significant portion of Germany. Now, there's always been some debate as to the impulse behind this. It doesn't seem necessarily as if Luther himself is pushing this down into the level of the populace. He wrote the Theses in Latin, and if he did post them on the door, which is probably likely in my view, he intended it then to be part of the academic conversation within the university and not something for the everyman to sort of join in with. But for whatever reason, they're sent around in German, and they are something of a smash hit with certain communities within the German world. At the very least, they create something of a buzz. The second thing that happens, though, is that Luther is less concerned with raising up sort of a grassroots popular resistance to the issue of indulgences, but instead he, still playing the role of the defender of the papacy and the defender of the church, takes the 95 Theses, writes something of an apology about them, meaning a defense of them, and he sends them to the Archbishop of Mainz, Albert, who, as we saw in our last lecture, is actually one of the men behind the sale of indulgences in Germany. Now, Luther does this on good faith. He's not poking the bear, you might say. He's not attempting to rouse the anger of the Archbishop. You might say that he's going to Albert with hat in hand, asking him to pay attention to what's going on with those who are sent out throughout Germany. In other words, he thinks Albert is more or less on his side. And it's that move, sending the 95 Theses with a letter to the Archbishop, that propels Luther more aggressively onto the stage and draws the gaze of the Pope. Because what Albert does is he doesn't really look at the Theses himself. Remember, Albert is really not much of a scholar or a theologian. He got his offices due to political power and money. But Albert has the Theses examined by someone else, someone in his entourage, for theological heresy, and when there are some question marks raised, he then forwards it to the Pope, to Leo X. And the response from the papacy, the response from Leo X, is actually rather ho-hum. They don't initially and immediately crack down with warnings and condemnations and scornings of Luther for his attempt to correct some of the understandings of indulgence sales and the power of the papacy. And as I've said before in previous lectures, that's actually pretty axiomatic for the Catholic Church, historically speaking. The Catholic Church doesn't tend, historically, to swoop in as fast as possible to shut people up. Often what happens in these cases, at least in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, is the Pope will exert indirect pressure. He himself won't write scornful letters or publicly condemn anyone, but he will send an entourage of people sort of surreptitiously around to try to calm the person down. And if there are threats, it's usually to the person in charge of the troublemaker. Well, over the course of about a year, that's exactly what Leo X does. And we're going to go through this chronologically, but we just want to note it now. Leo X's move for most of a year, if not 2 years, is to exert indirect influence on Luther, to let him know that he's heard in some ways, but that he needs to calm himself down when it comes to the authority of the Pope. Even if Luther has a theological leg to stand on historically, that the Pope has never claimed certain rights over the issue of salvation, that always belongs to Christ, and that papal authority extends over temporal jurisdiction of issues related to penance, etc. The Pope will not suffer long someone who wants to challenge his authority, no matter how rightly placed that criticism might be from Luther. But despite the coming firestorm between Luther and the papacy, there were a number of people who found Luther's initial ideas compelling. And it's this combination of a number of people, both in the universities and at the wider popular level within Germany, who find Luther compelling, as well as the eventual firestorm from within the magisterium and from the University of Leipzig as they attack Luther. That twin-pronged experience for Luther is the context that drives him to develop a more consistent vocabulary and articulation of his understanding of the theology of the cross and justification by faith. And so in April of 1518, Luther is actually invited by the University of Heidelberg to come and give a disputation or a live debate or live back and forth on the subject of indulgences and the things that he raised in the 95 Theses. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Luther being invited in at this point is not as radical as it might seem. Luther has yet to come under serious public fire for his stance on indulgences. At this point, he is somewhat provocative, but in some cases applauded for his stance on the subject of the controversial indulgence sales throughout Germany. And so the invitation by Heidelberg to come in allows Luther a public setting to really sort of hash out and debate his ideas. Now again, if you're a university-trained professor, the main place you do this is not in the quiet and solitude of your study, but very often in the public forum of a debate, where you dialogue back and forth and hash out more consistent vocabulary. Now, we don't have the sort of blow-by-blow transcription of the things Luther says at the Heidelberg Disputation, but we do know from eyewitness accounts that Luther's convictions and his perspective are becoming clearer as he is speaking publicly. April 1518 again, he goes to Heidelberg to do his disputation, and this really is a pivot for him. And one of the eyewitness accounts we have actually is a man who will become one of the most important reformers in all of the 16th century. And that man is Martin Bucer. Bucer is a man who we'll see later when we go through the life of Calvin. But Bucer is a significant reformer in his own right, who resides, frankly, somewhere between the Reformed position and the Lutheran position. He is certainly on the Reformed side of things, but later in life, as he refuses to become more Reformed in the sense of becoming anti-Lutheran, there are some from within the city of Zurich who begin to treat Bucer as a bit of a traitor. Bucer is, as we often say, irenic. That is to say, he doesn't want to choose sides if he doesn't have to. He wants a more generous perspective on Protestantism, and to the day he died, he was very appreciative of Luther, even if that meant that some of his brothers in the Reformed tradition found him a bit suspicious. Well, the beginning of his fascination and his respect for Luther begins here at the Heidelberg Disputation, because in the audience is Martin Bucer, himself still Catholic, yet because of Luther's force of his arguments, really sees the beginning of his change from Catholic to Protestant as beginning here at the Heidelberg Disputation. And Bucer attends, and he actually has a letter that he sends to a friend afterwards, in which he writes that Luther responds with magnificent grace, and he listens, he says, with insurmountable patience. He presents an argument with the insight of the Apostle Paul. Now, this is certainly sort of effusive language. He certainly loves Luther, but it gives at least a little bit of an inkling as to Luther's persona up on that stage. Luther, from about this point, and frankly all the way until the day he dies, simply has this effect on people whenever they see him face to face. People are just mesmerized by the way that he interacts and the sort of larger-than-life personality that he is. And Bucer wasn't the only one there who found Luther's ideas compelling. What's important about the Heidelberg Disputation, though, and the reason why I'm choosing to call it kind of a pivot point, is that Luther knew deep down that indulgences were not the only thing he really cared about. In fact, in a manner of speaking, indulgences were a proxy war, meaning that they're an attack on an element of the Catholic understanding of salvation and penance, etc. But they're not the whole thing. And what begins to happen in Luther's thinking and in his public expression of things, from roughly Heidelberg on, is that Luther transitions his language from being about indulgences per se, to instead be more about the fundamental issues of the will and the ability of the Christian to perform good works, and, more fundamentally, the power of the Pope itself. Now, we saw when we looked at the 95 Theses that Luther is at least hinting at a restriction of papal power. Well, over the course of 1518, he actually begins to push deeper into the subject, and he becomes a little more aggressive as time wears on about how uncertain he is, frankly, about the Pope's position in relationship to Scripture. Because the issue with indulgences and with some of the other practices that Luther is attacking with his theology of the cross is that they are fundamentally based on the power of the papacy and the magisterium to declare and to rule on these subjects. And so increasingly as the debates sort of go on and as he gets some criticism and he has dialogue with a number of people, Luther again and again and again realizes that his issue isn't so much indulgences per se, but that he no longer believes that the Pope should be allowed to say these things or to enforce these things. And this really is a vital point to understand when we look at the Reformation itself. Often it's said at a popular level that the Reformation was about the doctrines of grace, that the Protestant faith is focused, you might say, exclusively on the issue of justification. Well, that certainly is true in a material sense. That is to say, it is the subject of salvation and justification that causes the Reformation. However, from a doctrinal standpoint and from a historical standpoint, the root cause of the crisis is not justification alone that is the problem, but rather that Luther's criticism of the medieval understanding of salvation meant that he was led eventually into the conclusion that the Pope had no right to do these things, that the Scriptures were somehow being placed under the authority of the Pope, and that if the Pope was saying that he had the right to interpret Scripture, and that his interpretation of Scripture was that indulgences and penance was the order for all Christians to perform, well, then what Luther was led to believe eventually is that the Pope can be wrong, that he has no right to rule on these subjects, and therefore the fundamental sort of concrete bedrock issue amongst Protestants and Catholics from the very beginning is this issue of the authority of the papacy to rule on doctrine or to interpret Scripture. And as the next sort of 12 to 18 months unfold for Luther, the issue becomes less and less about indulgences and more about the authority of the Pope. And in fact, that issue in particular dawns in Luther's mind not so much because of his own self-awareness and his ability to sort of reason down to the foundation. Rather, the issue of the authority of the papacy and Luther's eventual rejection of that authority comes about by Catholics challenging Luther on this very point. And we can see this immediately following the Heidelberg Disputation. Leo X finds himself relatively unsuccessful at sort of the indirect method of putting pressure on Luther through some other means to get him to calm down. And so Leo sends in sort of a pit bull to take the first salvo of Luther's doctrinal positions. And that man is Sylvester Prierius. Prierius was a Dominican, and he lived in Rome where he was the master of the sacred palace, which means that he was on sort of the inner circle of the papal court itself. And Prierius is brought in as something of a scholar, and he's asked to offer the first major critique of Luther theologically in writing. And Prierius does this. He examines Luther's 95 Theses and some of his other pieces, and he draws up a response to it. And this is important because Prierius is the first to, semi-officially, though not officially, to refer to Luther as a heretic. And Prierius' focus is specifically on the issue of the authority of the Pope. He challenges Luther not with misunderstanding indulgences or with being curmudgeonly and complaining about abuses that he has no right to complain about. Rather, Prierius takes a different tactic in which he says, the Pope has allowed this, the Pope has caused this and pushed this. Therefore, Luther, Prierius says in a nutshell, shut up. It's not your place. The Pope has the right over this, and if you challenge that, you are a heretic. The authority of the Pope is supreme. Again, notice, in this case, and this is true in many places throughout history, often a fundamental problem that looks to be a doctrinal problem becomes one of authority when dealing with the magisterium. Pope Leo is not done, however. He also enlists the help of another cardinal by the name of Cajetan. And Cajetan is kind of one of these figures who sort of seems to show up everywhere in the Reformation as sort of a voice or a leader in the Catholic hierarchy. It's actually Cajetan, for example, who is sent up to England 13 years later when Henry VIII is having his issue with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and he's asked the Pope to consider an annulment, and it's Cajetan who's sent up at the Pope's urging to rule on this subject. And Cajetan is the one who has to figure out a way of telling Henry no without telling him no. And the story is sort of legendary. He sits and hears the case, and then rather than rule a verdict, which was next to impossible because he couldn't rule in either case without angering some major magnate or king in Europe, instead, Cajetan calls a halt to the meeting for summer break. He then scurries back to Rome and never comes back, and the rest is history for the formation of the Anglican Church when Henry VIII kicks the Pope out of England. But in this case, Cajetan is enlisted to go after Luther. And Cajetan and Leo do again a bit of an end around. They go to Frederick the Wise, the prince who has authority and jurisdiction over Luther, because he has authority and jurisdiction over Wittenberg and over the university. And they pressure Frederick to send Luther down to Rome. And they push pretty hard on this, alleging that Frederick is harboring a heretic, even though Luther has yet to be officially condemned. And they urge him to pack him up and send him on down to Rome. Well, it's at this point that one of the more curious realities of the Reformation sets in, which is that Frederick is a Catholic. Again, we've made note in previous lectures that the Wittenberg Castle has a staggering number of relics and things that could be part of a pilgrimage to the city of Wittenberg for the sake of penance and even for indulgences. And Frederick does not himself ever come under full fire. He's never tossed out of the Catholic Church for his role in defending Luther. But in this case, Frederick doesn't take the side of the papacy or of Cajetan. And it's hard to understand his mind here, but one of the elements that seems to be going on with Frederick, as well as others, is there's a real animosity to the idea that those in Rome would call one of their own, a German-born man, down to their midst, when they knew full well that Luther would never come back. So rather than say no, what Frederick does is he makes a demand that a meeting between Cajetan and Luther happen on German soil, and he makes a suggestion that it happen at the city of Augsburg. The papacy and Cajetan reluctantly agree, and Cajetan comes up to Germany to meet with Luther. Around this same time, though, the Pope does put together a papal bull in which he clarifies a couple of things related to indulgences. And that bull is known as cum post quam. Now, just a quick note on the naming of bulls and what these things are. A bull is essentially an official proclamation by the papacy. Today, these things often go by the name of encyclical or by other names whenever the Pope issues an official proclamation. But a bull is something that has the full power of the Pope behind it. And the way we name these things is usually we take the first 2 or 3 words in Latin from the text, and we just sort of call the document after these words. So in this case, the document begins with the Latin cum post quam, and therefore this is the name of the document. Well, this bull, cum post quam, does 2 things. First of all, it does put an end to some of the abuses that Luther complained about in the 95 Theses. And this is sometimes overlooked by Protestants in particular. The Pope does, in sort of a quiet way, put an end to some of the things that were so scandalous about the sale of indulgences. Things like playing on the emotions of those in the audience whenever you're preaching an indulgence sale, for example. However, this document, this bull, stands tall and does not back down at all on the issue of the Pope's authority to issue an indulgence, and these things are binding in that they have an efficacious role in the Christian life. For Luther, though, this bull was relatively irrelevant. It doesn't actually come across his radar. Instead, Cajetan comes up to the city of Augsburg in 1518 in October, roughly a year since the posting of the 95 Theses. And Cajetan and Luther meet, and it does not go well at all. In fact, the two eventually descend into a shouting match, and the situation is focused primarily on the subject of the Pope's authority. And it's at this point, again, Luther pushed and pressed, asked again and again to buckle under because the Pope's authority is supreme. Luther again and again begins to say, and he says it here to Cajetan, that he does not believe that the Pope can rule over Scripture, that he can be the interpreter of Scripture, that Scripture is over the Pope, and therefore if Luther finds a significant deviation from papal proclamation from what he believes to be the interpretation of Scripture, then Scripture wins and the Pope is not the interpreter of that text. So a year after the posting of the 95 Theses, Luther is confronted again and again and again with the issue of the Pope's authority. And from Prierius to Cajetan, Luther is forced and pushed and prodded to make further and further bold declarations about his understanding of the authority of Scripture over the Pope. And Luther very nearly lost his life here in October of 1518. Cajetan at some point notifies the authorities that they're going to meet again the following day, and that if Luther remains recalcitrant and will not rescind his heresies, that he is to be handed over and arrested and then put on trial in the civil government. And Luther slips away in the night and escapes. Well, by and large, 1518 is the big push from the official response from Rome, with Prierius and Cajetan and Leo X behind them, pushing a line of attack against Luther in which they say that he is disobedient and that he is challenging papal authority. After this moment, though, after October 1518, the battle sort of transitions, and what happens is the main opponent for Luther following 1518 becomes lodged in a university squabble between the University of Wittenberg and the University of Leipzig. Leipzig is a bastion of conservative Catholic thinking at this time, and one of the leading lights, one of the major figures, one of the major theologians of the University of Leipzig is a man by the name of Johann Eck. And because Luther was a university professor, and because Wittenberg and the other professors there rally behind Luther and become his biggest supporters, what Eck does over in the University of Leipzig is he takes Leipzig out into the battlefield and makes Leipzig the counteroffensive from the university standpoint over against Luther. And Eck is vitally important because what Eck will do is become, in a manner of speaking, Luther's nemesis. Eck will be the one who will be there at Luther's trial, and he'll be the voice condemning him as the prosecutor. And Eck, throughout Luther's life, becomes one of his biggest opponents, and Luther later, throughout most of his life, will have lots of scathing things to say about that little Dr. Eck, as he called him. Well, again, after the pivot of Heidelberg, and after Luther has confronted the official response from within the magisterium, from Prierius and Cajetan, Eck now comes to the forefront. And on into the following year of 1519, Eck cooks up an idea that he wants to have a serious showdown between the Leipzig faculty, led by him in this case, and the representatives of Wittenberg on these so-called new ideas about papal authority and indulgences. And so in July 1519, you have the major summit over these issues. And this meeting is known as the Leipzig Disputation. Now, in this case, there is sort of a bit of a strange twist to it that most students don't quite get right out of the gate. And that is that the Leipzig Disputation, when the University of Leipzig and Eck invite Wittenberg in, they, in a manner of speaking, can't invite Luther himself to be the primary speaker. There were all kinds of rules to these debates, etc., and often you have to invite the senior person from the order or from the university to be sort of the lead chair of the debate. And that's exactly what happens here. One of Luther's colleagues and one of his closest friends is a man by the name of Andreas Karlstadt. And Karlstadt was a supporter of Luther's views, and so therefore when Leipzig and Eck invite in the Wittenberg faculty and they want to draw Luther in to say something about his views, they actually invite Karlstadt to sort of chair the Wittenberg side, and Luther kind of has second chair, you might say, or he's the backup. But there's no escaping the fact that at Leipzig, it's Luther versus Eck, in a manner of speaking, even though Karlstadt, again, has the first voice on the floor. And the Leipzig Disputation is 4 sessions in July of 1519 that last for 18 days. These are serious, long-ranging, deep, prodding debates over all kinds of issues. But the 3 primary issues that they deal with are the issue of free will, biblical arguments about the basis of indulgences, or penance itself, and thirdly, papal authority as the bedrock of all of the Catholic system. And what Eck finally manages to do, what others have not been able to get Luther to do publicly until this point, is that when Luther is finally on the stage and he's defending his position over against Eck, Eck primarily doesn't deal with the issue of indulgences. Instead, when he has Luther in his sights, he goes specifically after the issue of papal authority. And, quite famously, Eck pushes Luther into a corner, you might say. Or if you don't want to make Luther sound weak, you might say he pushes Luther to realize from within his own theological system that what he's saying is essentially that the Pope can err, that church councils can be wrong, they can err, and that if Luther's interpretation of Scripture, I should say, goes over against either a council or a pope, Luther has to admit that the church magisterium can be wrong. Now again, this is not quite so controversial in the 21st century, but in Luther's day, this is extraordinarily controversial. Because really only a matter of about 100 years before, in the early 1400s, there was a man by the name of Jan Hus, who had done ministry in the city of Prague, and who had said many of these same things as well. He had denied papal authority, he had denied the infallibility of pope or council to rule on doctrine, and in the early 1400s, Jan Hus had been burned at the stake in the city of Rome. Well, what Eck does is really kind of a masterstroke from the Catholic side, which is that he gets Luther to frankly admit to being a Hussite, as they were called. And there is something of an apocryphal moment here. Whether or not Luther said it in these words or not, we're not quite sure. But at some point, Luther essentially admits that he is a Hussite, at least on this issue of papal authority. That with Huss, Luther admits, the Pope can err, a council can err, and Scripture alone is the thing that cannot err, and its interpretation must reign over our church. Well, again, in a manner of speaking, for Eck to force Luther to come to the realization that his theology is essentially Hussite, or essentially schismatic on the issue of the authority of the Pope, is, with running the risk of being a bit hyperbolic, it's the final nail in the coffin for Luther to avoid the title of being a heretic. And so there, July 1519, roughly a year and a half after the posting of the 95 Theses, after a lot of debating, both positively at the University of Heidelberg and then negatively in private with people like Cajetan, and now publicly against a man who would become his nemesis, Luther has now fully bloomed and blossomed, you might say, into his understanding of the theology of the cross and his understanding of justification. That because the fundamental issue is that Luther doubts and then eventually condemns this idea of the authority of the papacy, that it took this sort of pressure cooker time after the controversy of the 95 Theses for Luther to come to the bottom of what he actually believes and what his theology actually implied in terms of his relationship with the papacy. And so, after Luther has made this proclamation, and after he has not buckled under or caved under, when both the official response team from Rome, with Prierius and Cajetan, as well as the Leipzig University in the Disputation of July 1519, when Luther does not cave, from this point on, Luther is heading quickly towards being condemned as a heretic to eventually being put on trial. Okay, that's it. We've now come to the point where Luther is, in a manner of speaking, an open heretic. And in our next lecture, we're going to be looking at what happens to Luther as he is branded a heretic and put on trial at the Diet of Worms.